Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a time in life when the weight of the world feels too heavy to bear. When the burdens of your heart, the struggles of your soul, and the battles you've been fighting in silence seem unending. But I'm here to tell you we're never meant to carry it all alone. You see, the God who formed the heavens and the earth, the one who knit you together in your mother's womb, he knows your weariness. He sees the tears you cry when no one else is watching. He hears the silent prayers whispered in the stillness of the night. And he is calling you today, leave it in his hands. When the storm is too strong, when your strength feels depleted, remember this: God is not distant. He is near. He is the one who says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." God sees your struggles even when no one else does. There are moments in life when we find ourselves battling alone. The pain, the exhaustion, the stress, it all builds up and no one seems to understand. We put on a smile, act like everything is okay, and carry on with our daily routines. But beneath the surface, the truth is often different. We feel worn out, overwhelmed, and like we are carrying the weight of the world on our shoulders. And in those moments, it can feel like no one notices. It's easy to feel invisible, like no one truly understands what we're going through, or perhaps that no one even cares. The world continues to move while we stand still, lost in our own struggles. But here's the truth: God sees you. He sees your heart, your pain, your burdens. Even when you feel invisible to the world, you are never unseen by him. You are not just another face in the crowd. You are a child of the Most High God, and he knows every detail of your life. Every tear you've shed, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer, God sees you in the moments when you feel most alone. In fact, he's closer than you think, right there in the midst of your struggles. When you can't find the words to speak, he hears your heart. When you feel like giving up, he is the one who holds you up. Sometimes we wonder why others don't see our struggles. We wish they could understand the weight we carry, the emotional toll we endure, or the physical exhaustion we face. We long for someone to acknowledge our pain and offer comfort, but often we are left feeling as though our battles are ours alone to fight. It's in these moments of isolation that we must remember that even though others may not see, God does. He is never blind to what we're going through. While human beings may not always recognize the signs of your pain, God knows the depths of your soul, and he's deeply moved by what you experience. It's important to remember that God's perception of us is not based on the surface. People may only see the external, the smile, the appearance of strength, the outward composure, but God sees what is happening beneath it all. He knows when your strength is starting to fade, when your hope begins to waver, and when you feel like you can't go on. And he never turns his gaze away from you. When you feel the world has forgotten you, God's eyes are fixed on you, and his love for you never diminishes. Think about the story of Hagar in the Bible. She was a woman who was abandoned and left alone in the wilderness, yet God saw her. In the midst of her despair, when she felt utterly forsaken, God appeared to her and assured her that he had seen her suffering. Hagar called God by a name that means the God who sees. She had a profound revelation that even though she was alone in the desert, she was not forgotten. God had seen her pain, and he was there with her in her time of need. The beauty of this truth is that God's sight is not passive. He doesn't just see us from a distance. His seeing is active. When God sees our struggles, it moves him to action. He doesn't just observe from afar. He comes close, offering comfort, healing, and help. He sees you in your weariness and promises to be the source of your strength. When your strength is drained, he is there to fill you up. When you feel defeated, he is the one who lifts you up. His vision is not limited to a momentary glance. It is an ongoing, constant awareness of what you are facing. Even in your lowest moments when you feel like giving up, God's eyes are on you, and he is aware of everything you are going through. His care for you is not conditional on your perfection or your ability to keep up appearances. God's love is not based on what you do or how you perform. It is based on who you are in him. His eyes never leave you, and his heart is always with you. You are never alone in your struggles, no matter how deep or dark they may seem. When you feel like you're fighting a battle that no one else understands, take comfort in the fact that God knows. He sees your pain, your effort, your tears, and he's right there with you. He doesn't ignore your struggles. He sees them, and he's waiting for you to turn to him. He is always ready to step in and offer the help you need. You are not invisible to him, and you never will be. Surrender your burdens and trust his perfect timing. Life often seems like a series of obstacles, with each challenge coming at a pace that feels unbearable. We carry burdens that seem too heavy, emotions that weigh us down, and dreams that feel out of reach. We struggle to keep moving forward, to stay strong, to hold it all together. And in these moments, it's easy to feel like we're in control, like we have to keep pushing, keep fighting, and somehow make it all work. But the truth is, we're not meant to carry it all on our own. We weren't created to bear these burdens without help. God invites us to surrender it all to Him, to let go of the weight we carry and trust that His timing is far better than our own. When we surrender, we are acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, that we can't do it alone, and that God is the one who holds the solution. This doesn't mean giving up or giving in. It means recognizing that God's power is greater than our struggles. Surrender is an act of faith, a statement that we believe God has a plan, even when we can't see it. It's about letting go of our need for control, our obsession with trying to make everything work on our own terms, and opening ourselves up to the possibility that God's way is the best way. Trusting God's perfect timing is one of the hardest parts of surrender. We live in a world where everything is immediate. We expect results now, we want answers right away, and we're often frustrated when things don't unfold as quickly as we'd like. But God doesn't work on our timeline. His understanding of time is different from ours, and His plans are always far greater than anything we could imagine. What may seem like a delay, a setback, or an unanswered prayer is often part of His perfect design. His timing is always on purpose, and He knows exactly when the right moment will come. Think of the story of Abraham and Sarah. God promised them a child, but years went by, and still there was no sign of the promise being fulfilled. Sarah, in her old age, grew impatient. She tried to take matters into her own hands, attempting to force God's plan by giving Abraham her maidservant to have a child. But that was not the way God intended to fulfill His promise. The result of their impatience led to complications and heartache. It wasn't until God's perfect timing arrived years later that Sarah bore Isaac, the child of promise. In the end, God's timing was far more perfect than anything they could have planned on their own. We must remember that when we try to rush God's timing, we often miss the deeper lessons He wants to teach us in the waiting. The process of surrendering is not about passively waiting for God to act. It's about learning to trust even when we don't have all the answers. It's about growing in patience, understanding that waiting is not wasted time. It is a time of preparation, of refining our character, and of drawing closer to God. Sometimes God is preparing us for the very thing we are asking for, and He knows that we need more time, more growth, or more maturity before we're ready to handle what He has in store. Surrendering also means letting go of our fears and anxieties. When we are overwhelmed with life's challenges, it's easy to become consumed by fear. We fear failure, rejection, loss, and disappointment, but God tells us that we don't have to carry those fears alone. In fact, He calls us to cast our anxieties on Him because He cares for us. Surrendering means choosing to trust that God has it all under control, even when everything feels uncertain. It means giving Him the things that scare us the most and trusting that He is big enough to handle them. When we surrender, we are saying, God, I don't have all the answers, but I trust that You do. We acknowledge that our perspective is limited, but His understanding is infinite. We surrender our need for control and place our faith in His hands. We trust that His timing is perfect, even when we can't see the way forward. We trust that He is working behind the scenes, even in the moments when it feels like nothing is happening. Surrender isn't a one-time decision. It's a daily choice. It's a decision to trust God with our burdens every day, even when we feel like we can't keep going. It's choosing to let go of the weight we carry and allow God to carry it for us. It's choosing to trust His timing even when it's different from ours. Surrendering is an act of faith, and faith is what moves mountains. When we trust God and let go of our fears, our worries, and our need for control, we open the door for God to work in ways that we could never imagine. Rest is found in His presence, not in your striving. In the fast-paced world we live in, it's easy to believe that rest is something we earn, something we achieve after a long period of hard work. We push ourselves to the limit, thinking that only after we've reached a certain milestone or finished a project will we deserve a moment of peace. But the truth is, rest isn't something we can attain through our own efforts or accomplishments. True rest, the kind that heals and restores our souls, is found only in the presence of God. Our world tells us that the key to success and fulfillment is constant striving. We're encouraged to keep moving, to hustle, to grind, and to never stop. The idea of slowing down, of taking a break, is often seen as a luxury or a sign of weakness. We've become conditioned to believe that if we're not constantly working or achieving, we're falling behind. But this mindset is not the way God intended for us to live. He didn't create us to be machines endlessly working without rest. Instead, He designed us to find our strength, our peace, and our rest in Him. In the beginning, God set the example for rest. After creating the heavens and the earth, He rested on the seventh day, not because He was tired, but because He wanted to model the importance of rest for us. Rest is not an afterthought in God's design. It is an essential part of how He created us to live. When we rest, we acknowledge that we are not in control, that our strength is limited, and that we need God to replenish us. In His presence, we find the renewal we so desperately need. We don't have to work harder or strive more to earn His rest. It is freely given, a gift that we receive by simply being in His presence. When we talk about rest, it's not just physical rest. True rest goes beyond sleep or relaxation. It's a rest for the soul, a peace that transcends circumstances. The kind of rest that only comes when we stop trying to solve everything on our own, when we stop striving to fix things in our own strength, and when we allow God to take control. When we rest in God, we release our anxieties, our worries, and our need for control. We choose to trust Him with our problems, knowing that He is more than capable of handling them. It's in those moments of surrender, when we let go of our striving and enter into His presence, that we experience the true peace that passes all understanding. But resting in God doesn't mean we do nothing. It doesn't mean we sit idly by and wait for things to happen. Instead, it's a posture of trust and faith. It's choosing to stop relying on our own abilities and instead relying on God's power and wisdom. When we rest in God's presence, we acknowledge that He is the one who will guide us, provide for us, and give us the strength we need. We rest because we know that He is working even when we can't see it. We trust that His plans for us are good even when we don't understand them. We find peace in knowing that God is in control and that we don't have to carry the weight of the world on our own shoulders. Striving can often lead to burnout, frustration, and exhaustion. When we try to do everything in our own strength, we quickly find that we can't keep up. We may achieve temporary success, but it often comes at the expense of our peace, our joy, and our health. But when we choose to rest in God, we find that we are able to accomplish more with less effort. God's presence is the source of our strength, and when we lean into Him, we are able to work from a place of rest rather than striving. Rest is not about escaping our responsibilities or avoiding work. It's about finding balance and recognizing that we need God's help. It's about knowing when to pause, to reflect, and to recharge so that we can continue moving forward with His guidance. We are called to work, but we are also called to rest. And when we rest in God, we find that our work becomes more meaningful, more effective, and more fulfilling. Our energy is renewed and our minds are refreshed. In His presence, we find the strength we need to face each day with peace and confidence. Resting in God also allows us to experience His love and grace more fully. When we are caught up in striving, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that God's love for us is not based on what we do or how much we accomplish. He loves us simply because we are His children. We don't have to prove ourselves to Him. In His presence, we are reminded of His unconditional love and the grace He freely offers. Rest is an opportunity to simply be in the moment, to bask in His love, and to receive the peace He longs to give us. It's a time to stop working, stop striving, and allow ourselves to be filled with His presence. Faith grows when you release control to Him. It's natural for us to want control over our lives. We are taught to be independent, to take charge, and to make things happen. From an early age, we are encouraged to shape our own future, to have a plan, and to execute it. But the truth is, control is an illusion. No matter how much we try to manage every detail, there are always forces outside our control. Life doesn't always follow the script we write, and we can't always predict what will happen next. In those moments of uncertainty, faith becomes our anchor. It is through releasing control that we allow our faith to grow and deepen, trusting that God has a plan far greater than we could ever imagine. Releasing control doesn't mean giving up on our responsibilities or becoming passive. It's not about abandoning our dreams or failing to take action. Instead, it's about recognizing that there are things in life that we cannot control. And that's okay. Faith grows when we stop trying to manipulate every situation to fit our desires and instead trust that God is working in ways that are beyond our understanding. It is an act of surrender, of letting go of the need to be in charge and embracing the truth that God is sovereign over all things. The act of releasing control can be incredibly difficult, especially when we are facing challenges or uncertainty. We want to fix things to control the outcome, to make sure everything works out the way we think it should. But when we try to control everything, we often find ourselves overwhelmed and anxious. We become consumed by fear of the unknown, and our faith starts to wane. This is when we need to remember that faith isn't about controlling the situation, it's about trusting the one who is in control. It's about letting go of our need to understand every detail and placing our trust in God, knowing that His ways are higher than our ways. Throughout the Bible, we see examples of individuals who had to release control in order for their faith to grow. Take Abraham, for instance. God promised him that he would be the father of many nations, but the promise didn't come quickly. In fact, it took years for Abraham and his wife Sarah to see any sign of fulfillment. They tried to take control in their own way, but their efforts led to complications and pain. It wasn't until Abraham truly released control, trusting in God's timing and plan, that he saw the fulfillment of God's promise in the birth of his son, Isaac. Through the process of waiting and releasing control, Abraham's faith was strengthened, and he came to understand that God's promises are always worth the wait. Another powerful example is the story of Joseph. Joseph was given dreams of greatness, but his journey to fulfillment was far from easy. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. At every turn, he could have tried to control his circumstances, to fight back, or to make things happen on his own. But Joseph chose to trust God's plan, even in the midst of hardship. He released control over his situation, knowing that God had a purpose in every step of his journey. In the end, God elevated him to a position of authority, and Joseph was able to save his family and many others. Joseph's faith grew stronger with each trial, and his trust in God's control was evident in the way he handled every challenge. Releasing control is also about letting go of our fear. Fear often arises when we feel powerless, when we face situations that we cannot control. It's natural to fear the unknown, to fear failure, or to fear loss. But when we release control, we allow God to replace our fear with His peace. We trust that He will guide us through the storm, that He will be with us in every circumstance, and that His plan for us is good. Faith and fear cannot coexist. When we choose faith, we choose to trust that God is bigger than our fears, that He is more than able to handle whatever comes our way. When we release control, we open ourselves to God's transformative power. Faith doesn't just grow in the good times, it grows in the moments when we feel most vulnerable, when we feel like we're losing control. These are the moments when God works the most in us. He uses our struggles to refine our faith, to strengthen our trust in Him. The process of releasing control is not easy, but it is through this process that we become more dependent on God and more aware of His presence in our lives. We learn to rely on His strength instead of our own, to seek His wisdom instead of our own understanding. The more we practice releasing control, the more our faith will grow. It becomes a way of life, a posture of trust that we adopt in every area of our lives. We stop trying to manipulate outcomes, and instead we surrender our plans to God. We seek His will above our own, and we trust that His timing and His ways are always best. As we release control, we become more attuned to His voice, more aware of His leading, and more confident in His ability to carry us through whatever comes our way. Releasing control is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of deep faith, a faith that believes in the power and goodness of God, no matter what life throws our way. When you surrender, you open the door for God to work in ways you never imagined. It's easy to get caught up in the belief that we must do everything on our own, that we are solely responsible for making our dreams come true, for achieving our goals, and for controlling our own destiny. But the reality is that God has a plan for each of us, a plan that is far greater than anything we can envision for ourselves. However, in order for His plan to unfold in our lives, we have to open the door for Him to work, and that door is opened through surrender. Surrender is not about giving up, it's about releasing control and trusting that God's plan is better than anything we could have imagined. It's the act of letting go of our own desires, our own will, and placing our faith in the hands of the one who knows what's best for us. When we surrender, we stop trying to manipulate the circumstances, stop forcing things to happen, and instead, we allow God to take the lead. It's a radical shift in perspective, one that requires us to trust deeply in God's character and His love for us. One of the reasons we resist surrender is because we fear the unknown. We don't know what will happen if we let go of the reins, if we stop trying to control everything. We fear that things won't go the way we hope, or worse, that they will go wrong. But what we fail to realize is that by holding on so tightly, we are actually limiting what God can do in our lives. We are putting our trust in our own abilities and understanding, which are limited, rather than in the limitless power of God. When we surrender, we open the door for God to work in ways we never could have imagined, bringing about blessings, opportunities, and breakthroughs that would never have happened if we had tried to control everything ourselves. The story of the Israelites provides a powerful example of how surrender opens the door for God to work in ways we could never anticipate. After years of slavery in Egypt, God delivered the Israelites with miraculous signs and wonders. They crossed the Red Sea on dry land, and then they entered the wilderness. But soon they found themselves facing yet another challenge, the Promised Land. The land was full of giants, fortified cities, and obstacles that seemed insurmountable. And yet God had already promised them victory, but they had to surrender their fear and trust in His ability to conquer the land for them. God didn't require the Israelites to fight the giants alone. Instead, He called them to take a step of faith, to trust Him to fight their battles. But many of them couldn't fully surrender, and as a result, they missed out on the blessings God had for them. They were unwilling to let go of their own plans, their own understanding, and fully trust in God's power. It wasn't until a new generation led by Joshua was willing to surrender that the Israelites were able to take possession of the Promised Land. They marched around the walls of Jericho, trusting God's instructions, and the walls came tumbling down. This story is a powerful reminder that when we surrender, God can do the impossible. What seemed like an unconquerable obstacle was nothing in the hands of the Almighty. The walls of Jericho, the giants in the land, and the challenges ahead were all no match for the power of God. But those victories only came when the Israelites were willing to release their own plans, trust in God's timing, and follow His lead. When we surrender, we allow God to do what we cannot do ourselves. We allow Him to fight our battles, to move the mountains in our lives, and to bring about outcomes that are far beyond what we could ever imagine. Surrendering also requires a shift in our mindset. We live in a world that prizes self-sufficiency and independence, but surrender is the opposite. It's about acknowledging that we are not in control, that we cannot do it all on our own, and that we need God's help. This isn't a sign of weakness, it's an acknowledgement of God's greatness and our dependence on Him. The Apostle Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 12:9, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." It is in our weakness and our surrender that God's power is most evident. When we let go, we make space for God to work in ways that demonstrate His strength, not ours. It's important to remember that surrender is a process, not a one-time event. There will be times when we need to surrender over and over again, when we find ourselves holding on to our own plans and desires once more. But every time we choose to release control, every time we choose to trust God, we make room for Him to work in our lives in a deeper way. It's in the daily act of surrender that we see God move in our hearts, our circumstances, and our world. When we surrender, we don't just open the door for God to work in our own lives, we also open the door for others to see His glory. Our surrender becomes a testimony to the faithfulness of God, a demonstration of His love and power to those around us. When we trust Him, when we let go of our fears and our need for control, we show the world that our God is faithful and that He can be trusted. Through surrender, we become vessels through which God can work to touch the lives of others and bring about His purposes on earth. When you let go, you make room for divine intervention. So often we find ourselves stuck in a cycle of effort where we believe that if we just try harder, work longer, or push further, we will finally achieve what we want. We strive and struggle, thinking that our strength, wisdom, and ability will get us the results we desire. However, there comes a point when we realize that our best efforts are simply not enough. It's in those moments of frustration, exhaustion, and defeat that we are presented with a crucial choice. We can either continue to push forward in our own strength, or we can choose to let go and make room for God to intervene. The truth is, God's intervention is not something we can orchestrate through our own striving. In fact, it is often only when we stop trying to control every aspect of our lives that we create the space for His power to move. When we let go of our need for control, our need to understand, and our need to make everything happen on our own, we open ourselves to the possibility of God's miraculous intervention. He is a God who works in ways that are beyond our understanding, and when we surrender our plans and efforts to Him, He can work in ways that we could never have imagined. This concept of divine intervention is not just a theoretical idea, it is a reality that can be seen throughout Scripture. The Bible is filled with stories of individuals who experienced God's intervention when they were at the end of their own strength. Take the story of the Israelites, for example. As they were fleeing Egypt, they found themselves trapped between the Red Sea and the advancing Egyptian army. They were completely helpless. No amount of effort on their part could have changed the situation. But in their helplessness, God stepped in. He parted the Red Sea, and the Israelites walked through on dry ground, escaping their enemies. This miraculous act of intervention was not something they could have orchestrated on their own. It was only when they reached the point of surrender, when they stopped trying to control the situation, that God moved in a mighty way. Another powerful example is the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. In a time when Israel was worshiping false gods, Elijah faced a challenge that seemed impossible, proving the power of the one true God to an entire nation. He didn't rely on his own wisdom or strength to win the people over. Instead, he called on God to reveal Himself through a mighty display of power. He didn't try to manipulate the outcome. He simply trusted that God would act according to His will. And God did. He sent fire from heaven, consuming the sacrifice and revealing His power to the people of Israel. Elijah's faith and surrender made room for God to move in a way that no human effort could have accomplished. These stories remind us that God's intervention often comes when we are willing to let go of our own plans and efforts. It's when we recognize that we can't do it all, when we acknowledge our limitations, and when we finally surrender our need for control, that God steps in and works in ways we could never have predicted. The miracle of divine intervention is not about our strength or our ability to manage circumstances. It is about God's power to act on our behalf when we are willing to release control and trust Him. Letting go isn't always easy, especially when we feel the weight of responsibility and the pressure to succeed. Our natural inclination is to take matters into our own hands, to make sure everything goes according to plan. But when we allow God to intervene, we are acknowledging that His ways are higher than ours, that His timing is perfect, and that He knows what is best for us. We don't have to have all the answers. We just have to trust that God does. One of the key reasons that we struggle with letting go is fear. We fear the unknown, the possibility that things won't turn out the way we hope. We fear failure, rejection, and disappointment. But when we let go, we allow God to replace our fear with His peace. We trust that He is with us in every situation, that He sees the bigger picture, and that His plan is always for our good. Letting go doesn't mean that we won't face challenges. It means that we trust God to carry us through those challenges in a way that aligns with His will. When we let go, we stop fighting against the flow of His plan, and we allow His peace to guide us through the storms of life. Letting go also requires humility. It requires us to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers, that we are not in control, and that we need God's help. Humility is a recognition that we are not self-sufficient, that we need God's strength, wisdom, and grace to navigate life's challenges. In humility, we lay down our pride and our desire to control everything, and we open ourselves to the possibility of God's intervention. It's in this place of humility that we are most receptive to God's guidance and direction. When we let go, we also open ourselves to receiving God's blessings in ways we never imagined. Sometimes our own plans and expectations limit us from experiencing the fullness of what God wants to do in our lives. We may have an idea of how things should unfold, but God's plan is often much greater than we could ever conceive. When we release our expectations and allow God to lead, we open ourselves to blessings that we could never have foreseen. By letting go, we don't give up on our dreams or stop pursuing what God has called us to do. Instead, we surrender the outcome to Him and trust that His plan will unfold in the best possible way. Divine intervention happens when we stop trying to make everything happen and allow God to work on our behalf. We create space for Him to move, and in that space, miracles can happen.